there's good and bad stress, there's acute and chronic stress. And, technically it just means anytime we feel overwhelmed, that we feel like the demands are too much for our resources. When something happens, we mount a stress response and we recover. And that's beautiful.
I certainly experience stress. And when I do, I have tools related to, breath work, running, exercise, sleep, non-sleep deep rest. I'm a huge fan of all these. I'd love to just kick off by you explaining a little bit about the different forms of stress. We hear stress is bad, stress can kill us, no one likes to feel stressed, etc. But as you and I both know, that's not the entire picture.
So there's good and bad stress, there's acute and chronic stress. And, technically it just means anytime we feel overwhelmed, that we feel like the demands are too much for our resources. So that's kind of a very technical way to put it. But really, so much of life is about meeting challenges, but really how we respond, the stress response. So that's a distinction that we're still trying to get the field to talk about stress in a more specific way so that we can think about, well, what situations are in your life? They might be difficult ongoing situations like caregiving or work stress or worrying about health, your own or someone's. So when something happens, we mount a stress response and we recover. And that's beautiful.
What are the best ways for us to manage overthinking and ruminating on stressful topics? Because I certainly experience stress. And when I do, I have tools related to, breath work, running, exercise, sleep, non-sleep deep rest. I'm a huge fan of all these sorts of things. But when we succumb to stress and the thinking patterns take over, where the gears are turning and they won't stop turning, what does the science tell us about ways to manage those thoughts?
We have to have some awareness of how our mind works, or we're just like, a subject to thinking our thoughts are real, thinking that it's helpful to keep ruminating and problem solving, because that's our tendency, is to go toward whatever we think there's threat or risk and to problem solve that. But you could just be stuck there all day in this kind of threat mode or red mind state. And that's just a shame. We don't need to turn on that stress response all the time.
And give us an overview of the different forms of stress, how we can learn to recognize those. And then I'd love to transition from there into talking about some of the work that you've been doing on stress and stress-related eating and stress and how it relates to aging.
When we think about stress, we usually think feeling stress, reporting stress, and that's important. What our body's doing is also important. It's not always related to our mind. So measuring levels of the nervous system and how vigilant we are is another way that we can understand stress. And that's particularly important and interesting because that's how stress gets under the skin, and we might not be aware. We might not report stress, but we're still holding tension and being much more sympathetically dominated. We need to mount a big stress response to cope with things when we need extra energy, but then we can actually let our body relax and we can turn it off. And that's where the rumination comes in. We want to catch ourselves rehearsing and reliving stress or worrying about the next thing, saying right now, I'm safe.
Breathing is unique among the functions of the brain because it really originates as a brain function and then extends, of course, to the body, in that it represents a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. Because at any given moment, we're breathing, and of course, at any given moment, we can take control of our breathing. There are very few brain circuits that impact the body in that way. Like I can't suddenly just change my rate of digestion.
It's really beautiful how much we can increase our capacity to do things during stress.
While of course it appears that toxic stress, chronically unmitigated stress that makes us feel like we are at the world's mercy or the other people's mercy, will accelerate aging. It turns out that underexposure to stress leads to more rapid aging than what you describe as ideal amounts of stress.
Having no stress means we're not really living. Like we're not engaging in the gifts of life, which are inevitably have some challenge and risk. At any stage in life, we can be growing and challenging ourselves, even in our much later years. And growing our brain, and you know more than anyone, like, what does that hippocampal growth mean for their well-being and their cognitive function?
Yeah, it's interesting that hippocampus, of course, a brain area involved in formation and recall of memories. Most of the data say that the addition of new neurons is not the main reason for improvements in memory, but it is one of them. But Rusty Gage down at the Salk Institute did a study in the early 2000s where they took terminally ill people, and these people agreed to have their bodies injected with a dye that would label new neurons. We have an opioid system within us that is neurons and other cell types that can release substances into our brain and body that make us feel less pain and make us feel sedated, but at a healthy level, right? And yet there are a lot of things besides drugs that can activate this opioid system. What is the relationship between stress and eating and the opioid system?
Stress and eating is an interesting one. So most people, when they feel stressed, or, I'm just going to ask you, do you eat more or less when you're stressed?
Less, definitely.
And what does the body feel like when you're in that stress state, when you're not even hungry? You're kind of shut down in your digestion.
That I have enough energy from my neural resources, from adrenaline. And generally those periods of time when I'm not hungry coincide with a hyper focus on the stressor.
When you have a big stress response, your digestion is pretty much shut down. Like it would be the opposite. Eating would be the opposite of what your body's telling you to do. Most people complain about overeating or binge eating when they're emotional, when they're stressed. And so that's the more common pattern. And what that looks different both in the brain and biologically.
I learned something interesting about smoking and why so few people now smoke. One of the most effective messaging systems in the battle against smoking was to get young people to stop smoking, not by telling them it was bad for them, but by showing them videos of these rich men sitting around tables cackling about the fact that they're making so much money on the health problems of other people because of smoking. In other words, what they did is they made being a non-smoker anti-establishment. It seems like for the younger generation, the thing that's most effective is to activate their sense of rebellion. This has been true for probably hundreds of thousands of years, but it's certainly true in the last 100 years.
Let people know that we're vulnerable to all the marketing and that there really are suppression of data behind a lot of it. So it's happening with eating disorders too. Eric Stice, who's at Stanford with you, has been using this method, we call it dissonance, showing people with eating disorders how the food industry has been manipulative and has tried to design food for addiction. We've done these interventions with men and women that show that we can help them regulate using some of these mindful eating strategies for checking in. We wanted to do this with pregnant women because when you have excess weight and you're pregnant, you're really vulnerable to gaining excessive weight during pregnancy, which is not healthy for the mom or the offspring. First of all, we couldn't stop excess weight gain. The women in the control group gained about 60% of them gained excess weight during pregnancy, and same with our mindful group. So maybe it's the end of story. You'd stop there and say it fails, don't do it. There have been so many beautiful developments in the women who got the training that we just keep being shocked by how impactful this stress reduction training was. It was just 2 months of their life, but pregnancy is a very critical period when these women were changing their habits and they're very motivated to help their baby.
Have there been any long-term studies of stress intervention? In the studies that we do in our laboratory, we get people for a month, they do one intervention, we swap them to another intervention. In a month, we analyze data. What can we learn about the long-term outcomes of things like body scans, meditation, and then we'll get into breath work?
I think the meditation studies are probably the best example. There are some studies that have either followed people who have taken up meditation, or just these cross-sectional studies where you compare a long-term meditator to someone who's never meditated. Yeah. I think they're amazing ways to get to know the mind and to really calm the body in ways like a quantum shift in our level of stress that we don't get. It's very hard to get in short bouts.
For those of us that find ourselves in a state of chronic stress, And here I'm talking about the kind of stress that you mentioned before. I think a lot of people hear the words radical acceptance, at least this is what they told me, and think, oh, that means that you have to just accept what is and deal with it. There's another form of radical acceptance, which is I radically accept the fact that I'm not going to deal with this, right? I'm going to walk away from it.
I think it is partly how we view life and our purpose in our own life.